What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Mr. Clark After Dark. Today I have on the one and only Cathryn van Kassel. Kat is currently a associate professor at Texas Christian University. She was also a professor of mine at the University of Alberta for one of my, I would say, the most interesting courses that I took. On the episode, her and I discussed the misconceptions of evil and what that word actually means in the context of social studies, our assumptions of what evil looks like, when people think they're actually doing good, but they're actually committing evil acts, examples along the spectrum of evil, worldview threat, terror management theory, the social aquarium, the subtlety of worldview challenges, philosopher Alain Badiou, what it means to avoid bear territory, how standardized testing shapes our idea of what education is, and how standardized testing is much better in certain contexts than others. All of that, of course, and much more coming right up. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. All right, Dr. Evil, thank you for coming on and joining me here today.
Happy to be here.
So, teaching social studies obviously has been a large part of your life, but I've noticed a huge part of it touches on, is it the concept, is it the subject of evil? Mm-hmm. What, I guess, is most misunderstood about evil in the social studies classroom?
Ooh, that's a deceptively hard question. I would
jumping right in.
Right, yeah. Like, well, there's no warm up. What? I jest. Yeah. I would say that the biggest misconception, and I'm going to be bold. I'm going to say within and beyond the social studies classroom is when people think that intention is the kind of defining feature. So,
okay. So what do you mean by intention?
Like someone is actively causing harm. So, the textbook social studies example, literally and figuratively, would be Hitler, where clearly that guy was aware that he was harming people. Not a good guy. And no one's absolutely contesting that. But I worry that when we see everybody like that, we assume that that's what evil looks like, then we don't see evil in sort of the more ordinary manifestations, accidental evils. And one of the most insidious forms, I think, is when people think they're doing good and they're doing evil. And that gets us in a real pickle.
Please go. What is an accidental evil? I'm going to be pretty much questioning every word you're saying as we're going, but just kind of trying to unpack it a bit for myself.
So like an accidental evil, I would say, I don't know, maybe something like a microaggression. I was thinking about this because actually my university does some training in this area, and I actually did a seminar on this morning as a participant. And that really got me thinking about how, someone might actually be trying to offer a compliment. So, one of the examples we looked at was if someone is from a foreign land, you're like, oh, your English is so good. But of course, like that foreign land might have English as it might be from like Nigeria, but then it's intended, it's accidental in terms of like someone may actually be trying to be nice, not realizing, the harm that causes as this person feels, like an outsider.
I was having a conversation the other day with one of the teachers I work with, also teaches socially where I'm teaching. And he said, black man moved from Jamaica to Canada. And he said one of the craziest things that would happen to him was, and I don't mean to just jump in and kind of tell his story, but like what he said happened to him was he would have professors that be like, oh, that was actually a very like intellectual point, assuming that he wasn't capable of like intellectual, like didn't have an intellectual capacity, which is obviously a crazy assumption. But again, even someone who can be as well versed or I guess educated, however, we can go into the definition of education, what that means later 100%. If you want. But I mean, just kind of the obvious blindness.
Yeah.
Or like the unwitting blindness of just kind of the most obvious fact.
Absolutely. And then it's like a death by a million cuts, right?
Mm-hmm. And so when it comes, what have you learned and how has your kind of perspective changed? Because like obviously we have microaggression and we have Hitler as kind of like our spectrum of evil, if you will. Like how do you go about trying to, I guess, implement evil as a through line through your classes? And like, what are some other examples that kind of shows that spread?
Well, I really like to talk about, things like Indian residential schools, or I'm in the
Hmm.
United States now, so they refer to them as boarding schools. As this sort of, that's when someone's trying, many, but not all, right? Like
Hmm.
there's certainly, we could argue there are some people involved in that project who are more of that intentional evil, but a lot of them thought, they were saving these children. They thought this meant they would go to heaven. Like they had these, in some ways very beautiful intentions. And yet, because it was this imposition, and coming from that, ethnocentric point of view, like it, literally harmed people in countless ways, physically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, all of these sorts of things. So that's something that I find, pops up in a lot of social studies classes. And like, how do we sit with that? That, some of the people probably had bad intentions, some of the people had good intentions, and some people had no intentions at all. And yet they were all part of this project that really hurt. Um,
Hmm.
Same thing when you're talking about like a genocide in Rwanda, for example, which I used to do in,
Yeah.
grade 11 social studies in
Oh yeah.
Alberta.
Yeah.
We have, a book where someone interviewed the killers of Rwanda. And
Machete Season.
exactly.
Fantastic book. I mean,
What a
in
read.
like, yeah, I know. Not a fantastic book, but you know what I mean.
100%.
Yeah.
It's a must read. It's not
Yeah.
going to bring you joy, but
No.
I mean, I think the nuance that's there, because, if we really want the world to be a better place, if we really want it to
Hmm.
hurt less, I think we have to sit with all of the nuances and complexities, even though we really want to be like, well, we're good. They're not. I'm not like them at all. So and this is where the
Yes.
through line gets in of like, how do we take
Hmm.
these historical things and then bring them close to home to be like, well, how are we going to do better?
Yeah, because one of the things, because this kind of brings up, I guess, a point where in my, I guess, young social career, where I find I fall flat is the necessary step, I think, is to go from, okay, you have the Rwanda genocide, you have obvious bad actors who are kind of actively engaging it, but then how do you kind of get to the point where, like, obviously one person can have a bad idea and no one acts on it. But when you
Sure.
have an entire country that is convinced not only to kind of kill on mass scale, but also that they assume they're doing good. Like
Hmm.
the term ethnic cleansing, like people like things to be clean. Like there's a
Hmm.
deliberate reason why that word is used. So like they literally think it's getting rid of like dirt, which I mean, like you use the words vermin, etc. Like kind of the language
Yeah.
that's used. But I guess I always find I get to that point in my teaching, and then it's all like I don't really know where to go from there. Like the kids kind of
Yeah.
understand that gap and just say like, okay, Mr. Clark, like I can see that you're saying it's not just one person who made a policy and that everyone followed. It's like people actually think it's good, but I guess I don't really know how to unpack that further. I don't know if I'm asking you for advice or kind of input, but what do you kind of think about that?
Well, I always think that evil studies is like part pedagogical technique, part therapy, for us and for our students. So
Yeah.
I really turn to social psychology for that. And I draw
Hmm.
from Ernest Becker, who talks about the
Hmm.
fetishization of evil. And
Yeah.
so I would spend time, and this was with grade 11 and 12 students, this was with pre-service teachers.
Hmm.
We'd spend some time thinking about how it's sort of a natural, although disturbing, part of our psychology to have this like in groups and out groups, and if uniting behind a common enemy, these kind of
Hmm.
things, and showing that fills a psychological need. So it's kind of the getting them to the point where they see that the urge or the tendency isn't bad in itself, but it turns into something bad. And so this is where it turns into quasi therapy. Like, how can we see this in
Hmm.
ourselves? So I would teach them a little bit about like the psychology behind it. We'd have this dramatic historical example. And then what we do is we go through those same steps with something so much more banal. So with my undergrads, I would do something like, okay, well, they would be in their third or fourth year. It'd be like, okay, well, first year students are like this. And then you go through say, well, I don't really want to be around first years because I think they're like this. Oh, wouldn't university be better if first years wouldn't there? This kind of thing. We kind of go on like with like a really banal example,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But
relatable. Yeah.
you're not telling them beforehand, right?
No, no, no. You kind
Okay,
of
yeah.
like
So you're doing this kind of like unpacking on purpose. Okay.
absolutely. And then you kind of go
Yeah.
in and then you see like I would bring in often things from the news. Like here's this same rhetoric where, so I remember at the time when I was still in Alberta teaching pre-service teachers, this was when Donald Trump had that line about swarms at the border. And we're like, well,
Yeah.
what's the power in that word swarm? And, you're talking obviously about like dehumanization and those
Yeah.
scapegoating, these kind of things.
It's like a pest kind of connotation to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So looking at those stages, because how I explain the fetishization of evil to them is that's when scapegoating turns into eliminating them will give us heaven on earth again. So it's sort of this leap from what's a term that they're usually familiar with.
When it comes to like the fetishization of evil, because obviously like the word fetish has like a sexual connotation to it as well. And so when you're talking about, is it almost like the obsession with evil? Is that kind of what you're getting to? It's like, is it that?
Or like a deep desire.
Okay.
I would say
you just triggered the like Alexander Solzhenitsyn quote of like the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every man. So I feel like, but I guess, I don't know. I guess I find the students are always like, oh, I'm not like that. I guess I don't really know how to get them to, and I guess you really don't. Like, I mean, most but not all kids are going to be generally good and not actually kind of have those open desires, I guess. Yeah, I guess how has your thought process on evil like changed throughout your research? Like, would you define it differently from like the beginning to now?
That's a good question. I definitely think I've refined the sort of evils that interest me. Like when I started out, I was interested in pretty much any conceptualization of evil aside from a religious one, because I kind of wanted to stay in my lane. Like that's the job for like priests and pastors and rabbis and so on and so forth. So I was like, okay, I'm going to steer away from religious conceptualizations of evil, but anything else is on the table. And
so what's a sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but
no, not at all.
Like what is the difference? Like what is a you might have been going here. What is like a conceptualization of evil? Like how are they different than a religious one?
Oh, so like, drawing from philosophy or psychology rather than from, constructions of
like
evil.
An inner demon.
Yeah. So it's sort of really looking at evil as a human thing as opposed to a supernatural thing. Even though that's hugely fascinating. I mean, there's whole sections of folks, who are religious scholars, who could get into like some of the nuances and fascinating bits about that. And sometimes I can find some potential for crossovers, but again, like I just try to stay in my lane because I want to not insult anyone's cherished, beautiful beliefs, of course.
Yes, fair enough. Yeah.
But yeah, so kind of like, anything was on the table. And then the more that I've studied it, the more I have focused my attention on conceptualizations of evil, where evil is a process as opposed to a person or a thing, and things that are really relatable to our ordinary lives. And I think some of this is just sort of the things that I encountered that connected with me. And I think some of it is my personal ethos of like, why am I doing this? Like I had to do a bit of soul searching at some point. Like, why am I bothering? Why am I looking at this horrible stuff all the time? Because it's not easy. You're trying to walk through the world and you're studying these things and reading these things. And some days I'm like, how am I getting out of bed? Why am I eating so much chocolate? What's happening? And so like, I had to do some soul searching, because at first I thought it was because I wanted to be a better social studies teacher, because that was my initial motivation. Like I was teaching, kind of like the little genocide mini unit in grade 11 in the ultranationalism
feels so
section.
heard right now.
right. And I would teach that class, and either it would be so cold, I'd have students in my hand being like, Ms. VK, like, so how many million? I just want to get the number right. So it'd be cold like that, or they'd all be in tears at the end of class. And I was like, why suck at this? Like I have to do something that's not one of those two
too
things.
Much extremes here.
Right? I'm like, there's got to be, and of course there has been work on teaching that sort of thing that I just hadn't really been fully exposed to. And so I initially, that's what I was starting to do, is like, how do I teach these things? And
so I guess how did your goal change? Because again, like almost everything I've like, I even say it to like people I talk to because of who I am as a person. When I took like my history poli-sci degree, whatever, that's the general rite of passage if you want to do this kind of stuff typically. And even in university, every single course selection I took was aimed at, okay, what are the courses offered in the Alberta curriculum? Obviously, I'm still teaching in Alberta. And then like secondary social, it was always like questions about the Alberta curriculum. So everything has kind of been in service, I guess. One, obviously, because you have some intrinsic motivation. You obviously want to improve. You want to be better. You want to actually try to provide some value. I often get the discussion of like, oh, Mr. Clark, what's the purpose of social studies? So I've kind of made it my life goal to try to offer a great answer to that question.
Oh, wonderful.
And I mean, for better or worse. But when it comes to, I guess, how your goal has changed, because like it seems like you're kind of summarizing my entire life. So how have your goals kind of changed in like the process of your research?
Well, where I've landed now is honestly a lot about reconnecting with my family history. My paternal grandparents, my Oma and Opa, were in the occupied Netherlands during the Second World War. And both of them were in the Dutch underground. So my Opa was an active combatant, and my Oma was sort of smuggling weapons, smuggling supplies to the resistance fighters, and so on. And so over time, like it's turned, especially as I'm getting farther and farther away from the K-12 classroom, I've been sort of thinking of like how do I honor what they did, and be in a world where like I'm in Texas now. So I joke I went from Texas North to Alberta South.
100%.
Yeah, totally. Right. Even super, like not superficial things, but even like land-based things, like the big sky, like the sky is huge here, just like it is in Alberta. Like it feels very homey. But we're in these places where I think there's a majority like good people, really good people, some of them with different ideologies, some of those in conflict, some of those not in conflict, some misunderstandings, like these kind of things. And, I see there's sort of a great deal of hope nested in community and nested in that self-work that takes us to understand like what we play in these bigger things that might happen, like genocides, like these sorts of things, to be, what work can I do in my little way that's not like hiding behind a haystack with Gestapo going by or whatever. like what kind of contribution might I make to a world that hurts less? And so I think that's kind of where I am at, which in some ways is higher stakes, but in some ways, because it's more nebulous, I think gives me some like intellectual play to be like, how do I see this impact, and when does my writing matter and when does my writing, or when does it, when doesn't it? Like why I'm excited about going on podcasts like your wonderful podcast, this sort of thing is like, well, I'm not really happy with my work just living in a nerdy article that maybe my dad reads, right? Like what's where's that power in in the teaching? And I mean, I still think it's very important for academics to write, so I don't want to disparage that at all. It's just for me, I wanted to live in different ways. Yes.
Well, I almost wish like more academics, which I think is starting to be more of a trend, like having podcasts, because I know it's a lot of kind of groundwork and stuff to kind of figure it out, but trying to just kind of bring these ideas more to make them more accessible. Because even I've noticed myself after leaving university, like I don't have access to that university library anymore,
right?
Or like the JSTOR subscription, which I mean, it's things when you're forced to write an essay for a course or whatever, you're like, geez, I got to go take out these books. But it's definitely something because I remember like I had Denhire as well, who was, I'm still trying to email him to get on. And we were just talking. He's like, when you become a teacher, the busyness of that life will take away a lot of your kind of, not maybe take away, but it just kind of supplants like your professional learning in a way. It's like you don't have time to read 3 articles when you teach 7 hours and then you don't have a prep. And I mean, you can enter extracurricular list here, but it is very true where I find it's a little bit difficult to kind of break that down. But I think that it is starting to, I guess I'm losing we're talking about academics starting podcasts, getting their work out there and finding value. But I do think that's starting to come around a bit more now.
Yeah.
How have you found so are you still teaching undergrads in
I'm
Texas? Is
still
that
teaching
correct?
undergrads, but I'm more adjacent rather than directly in teacher education. So there's like
Okay.
an undergrad class that I sometimes teach that pre-service teachers will take up from all subject areas, called Schools, Curriculum, and Society. And it's basically social studies for pre-service
Mm-hmm.
teachers of,
Yeah.
what's happening in schools and why, and what are the structures in place and how do we navigate it. So I'm no longer teaching like social studies methods. So that's been a
Hmm.
different switch for me. So I'm mostly doing now graduate education. So master's students, here we have a program where you can do a master's sort of overlapping with your undergrad degree. So you get kind of like a bonus year to dive
Cool.
into stuff. So that's
Yeah.
really exciting because they're about to go out in the field. And I see, elementary, secondary, and in secondary, all sorts of subject areas. Although it was funny this semester, I did teach a couple of students who were secondary social studies, and I'm like, we're best friends now. Here's all the things.
I don't know if you knew this or not, but yes.
Yeah, it's like you have no choice
And
in this
so,
matter.
and I guess, and maybe I've had like two words that I've almost found. Maybe they're just beyond my intelligence to understand, but so I guess disclosure, I was just interviewed for a job because I'm potentially moving, or most likely moving to New Brunswick. So
Oh, wow,
still staying in
cool.
Canada, but and she asked me about the word strategies and methods.
Sure.
And it almost seemed there are words that seem so self-evident to me in terms of like it's just the way I kind of carry out what I do. But I guess
Right.
how would you define, because like I guess is a through line question, like that, is that kind of like tool of using a through line to guide your curriculum, is that a method or a strategy?
I would argue that it
Right.
is a method, but that's
A
part of a
method.
larger
Okay.
strategy. Because for me, strategy I see as very
Yeah.
goal oriented, So I'm going to use a
Okay.
strategy where making social studies relevant, because this is why I love through line questions, because it
Mhm.
gets to the heart of the subject matter, but it's like you're ethically entwined with it. You've got some sort of personal stake in it. So,
Mhm.
so I would say like that sort of ethos is kind of a broader strategy. And then the method is like the specific thing. So you're going to have a through line question and you're going to have an essay question or a thought book entry or something like that that's sort of kind of off that. But but having said that, I've had people say use strategies and tools and these sorts of things sort of
Yeah, I like the word tools. I don't know
synergistically. Yeah.
why. I don't know if it just makes me feel like I know I have tools. Like it's a I don't know how to use any handyman tools, so maybe that just makes me feel better about myself. But oh my gosh, all my secrets are coming out on here. But
I told you it's like therapy. Huh? You're like, I'm never having you on again.
absolutely.
Tell me
Well,
about your
speaking of
mother.
well, well, actually, I won't tell you about my mother, but I guess a lot of the times about like the research is me search part, because a lot of
Right.
the what I've noticed about a lot of the terror management theory stuff is kind of
Mhm.
the consideration of death and
Yeah.
like how that affects you. So
Right.
I guess I'll kind of go through the strand of how I've introduced. I guess first off, how would you differentiate worldview threat from terror management theory? Did I already
Worldview
ask you that? I
threat.
don't think so.
No, you didn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
worldview threat is like a subset of terror management theory research. So
Yeah.
there's lots of other stuff that kind of sees that same root problem, that
Mhm.
the denial of death puts us in a real pickle. And so there are researchers all across the world doing neat stuff. So some, would look at the role of loving relationships. There's some really neat work about medical health decisions and these sorts of things. Worldview threat and defense has always been my favorite part of terror management theory, just because I think it's so highly relevant to social studies, because it's looking at these sort of social interactions among groups, whether that's the nationalism we study in grade 11 or the
Well,
ideologies you
yeah.
study in grade 12. Like, it's such a helpful frame.
Well, and honestly, it was kind of again, using my cheesy university vernacular here, like the educational event. It was like,
Yeah. Ooh.
I almost like didn't know. I'm like, well, what is social studies outside of worldview threat?
Right.
You know what I mean? That's kind of the purpose, is like,
Yeah.
how do we deal with these? I mean, obviously you can go on probably for days about why it exists outside of Worldview Threat. But I guess what I'm saying is kind of the complex interaction of different cultures and individuals is basically what we're trying to look at here.
Yep.
And I guess the way that I usually kind of, because right now for Black History Month, it's kind of not molded well with what I've been teaching, but like ethnic nationalism, going into that in the first part with grade 11.
Sure.
I basically, I guess maybe scaffold. I'm not meaning to use all these like random buzzwords here, I promise, but I usually try to introduce stuff about like the Black codes and the Jim Crow era a little bit, and then I'll kind of explore the context a bit. But then basically my main question is, what makes conversations on racism so difficult?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it seems like a very obvious question, but then I go into things like the social aquarium and things like worldview threat and terror management theory. So I guess my question would be, like, worldview threat, I explain as the emotional reaction you have, and the reason when someone kind of challenges your structure of belief, I guess, and then the reason you have an emotional reaction is because you've kind of survived up to this point believing a certain line of thinking. So it actually like threatens your survival. Is that accurate, you think?
Yeah. I'd say that's great. I think the only thing I would add is that it's that challenge can be super subtle. Like, it makes sense. Like, if I go up to you and we're in different worldview groups and I'm like, your worldview sucks. Like, of course you're going to want to punch me in the face. But if we're just existing and I'm living my happy little life with a different way, even if I'm not confronting you at all about that, you just seeing me live happily or successfully or whatever with another worldview, even that can instigate, the worldview threat. So that that challenge can be completely unintentional and super subtle.
Okay, so I think maybe what I'm kind of missing is the emphasis on the micro. And honestly, now that it seems kind of very plain now that you've said it, it's like the application of the micro is the most relevant. Like, that is kind of what they're going to see in their everyday experience.
Absolutely.
So I guess how would you categorize like an example of a micro worldview threat?
Well, I mean, we'll see in a classroom, someone will bring up like a different political view, for example. They'll say something that is like coded to, say, a particular political party. And I find in both Alberta and in Texas, that coded language is always there on, for every single of the every single, there's like 2 here and 3 there. So like for the tiny few that we have until we have real democracy with like 10 parties, but that's a whole other podcast. Anyway, so there'll be something, then it'll be kind of coded in this way, so it'll resonate as these sort of like, I'm saying something that is from this very particular standpoint. And then you can just see the effects of that in the class. So some people will react in like a cold way. So you'll see them withdraw. They'll fold their arms. They'll push back, they'll get silent, they'll doodle angrily, this kind of thing. Like, you can tell that they're activated, and they're pushing that down. Just like, so your listeners can just imagine me like scrunching my face and my hand at the same time, crushing down. Enjoy the visual, friends.
Yes.
And then you've got the ones that will like pipe back and have that, perhaps a very animated, even very angry response kind of thing. And then what we want to do is steer them from neither of those reactions. So don't withdraw, but don't have the hot reaction, but rather like, how can we be curious and ask the different questions instead? So instead saying like, okay, so when I hear you say that makes me think about this. And it would be, probably a disastrous outcome from whatever it is that they said. And then you can have a conversation. Well, actually, I'm thinking about it from this, and be like, oh, okay. And then they might be able to dialogue across difference. Because something that I find in Alberta and I find here is people don't actually disagree as much as they think they disagree. There's, there are some exacerbated examples, but especially
it's
the
always
students.
a sobering time when we do the political compass test.
Oh, sure.
We're like, oh, we actually, what? That's weird.
Right? Like it's, and I think that they're sort of, again, it primed to assume that either they think the worst of that other person, or they're worried that that person thinks the worst of them already, and they've read that in. And so there's sort of this very quick escalation that can happen, or a complete shutting down. And both of those are unhelpful in the classroom. We want chatting, we want, whatever. And like, obviously there's rules, like, I mean, if someone says something hateful that insults someone's dignity or right to, like, I mean, obviously that's automatically off the table, but how can we cultivate sort of like an unconditional positive regard, aside from being intolerant of intolerance? And there's ways to do that.
Okay, I guess I was kind of going to start going, the desired reaction is critical reflection and curiosity. I think 100%. It's like, honestly, as no matter how heinous we go, that is kind of the root goal. And I always come back to my good old university days, where it was like, what is the story that makes that make sense to that person?
Right.
So, like, for example, even yesterday, or I didn't really go through, it was a video of the Jesse Washington lynching. It was in 1914. I mean, there's so many cases of lynching, obviously, unfortunately, but this one specifically stands out because it was like 15,000 people came in a mob, and you just see a picture of like a person smiling in the background, and I'm just like, that comes back to your like when you're doing evil but you think you're doing good. Like it comes across as, this is like an Oilers game to them. Like, to use my Alberta reference, like, this is entertainment and this is like fun. And I'm like, I always kind of use the example, I don't know, maybe it's the best way to kind of conceptualize it, but I always say, if you think about, okay, like my grandfather, or their grandfather's 80 years old, his grandfather was 80 years old. I'm like, you look at 1860, that's 2 people ago. Right? Like, that's not that long in terms of the actual spread of how far we're going back here. And then that one's in 1914.
Sure.
Like, we're not even that far, really. So I think, I don't know, maybe you're just reassuring that maybe I'm actually doing my job correctly. But
sounds like it.
the imposter syndrome is very real over on this end. So
I feel that deeply, friend. I feel that deeply.
Another podcast there too.
Yes, totally.
And I don't mean to go like too much into the theories here, because I wrote down, and I'm not sure how involved you were, because it seemed like it was the U of A professor thread, was everyone talked about Alain Badiou.
Oh, yeah. Both Kent and Hare and I would be responsible for that, probably.
And I guess I remember being viscerally overstimulated with that entire conversation about Badiou. And I wrote down, I tried to just think about like things that I remember without looking at my old notes. I was like, I have bear territory of like before you go into bear territory, like watch it so you don't get clawed.
Yeah.
And I wrote down the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real.
Oh, okay.
But I can't tell you what those mean. Like, what can you kind of add to those? I guess if there's like a missing perception, or like it's not a through line method, but what is the value of Badiou that you think every teacher should at least consider implementing?
Sure.
Or is it an implementation? Yeah.
Well, with the symbolic, imaginary, and real, it comes from Jacques Lacan. But Badiou kind of sort of followed in some ways and broke in other ways. And
it's always the academic humility there. It's like, oh, it's actually this person had the idea.
But it would have probably come like from Kent's class, for example. He talks about both, I think, brilliantly. So I think the value of like those kind of things is being like, okay, well, we take the real for granted, or what we consider to be reality. And interesting stuff pops up when we realize that that's a little bit shakier. So when we've got like this symbolic, it's sort of like, well, how, like, we can't really interact directly with the real. So we're, it's through signs and symbols that we are interacting. And so how is that affecting how we perceive reality, and therefore how we construct our societies? And I think Badiou takes this in a really cool direction. And as he's sort of thinking about how we ourselves as human beings have this equal potential for change. And this is why I love Badiou, and talking about him sometimes gives me a shiver, because there's this amazing opportunity for us to think that like we're all We all have the potential to have, like you talked about an educational event earlier.
Yeah.
Like we can have these moments where what we took for granted as reality or as truth or these sorts of things, like that can shatter. And although sometimes people think that's like an aha moment, but it's kind of more of like a uh-oh moment of like, uh-oh.
I've been living a lie.
100%, right? And so, but there's this amazing opportunity for growth as a human being if we are open to it, or as educators that we stop foreclosing events from happening in our classrooms, where we can like learn and grow. So I think about the terror management theory stuff, like the worldview threat and defense stuff, as a potential educational event. Like we can never orchestrate an event. People are going to have one or they're not going to have one. And I mean, we can do things that maybe don't block it, but we can't make it happen. But there's this invitation for them to be like, oh, I'm not as rational as I thought I was. And it's fine that I'm not rational, but I need to recognize that, I need to own that, and I need to make sure that emotionality isn't hurting someone else. So we don't want to be like anti-emotion, but we don't want to have like unbridled, like emotions are kind of like our children in a way. Like we can't fully control them, but we are responsible for them.
That is a great framing.
I've stolen that from someone who I don't remember. I wish I could credit them.
Okay.
But it's and I think I think worldview threat can be that potential event where people sort of see themselves with humility, but at the same time with hope, and see that potential for us, our communities, our larger societies to hurt less.
Okay, so I guess what I'm gathering, and this is kind of what I gathered, I think, like when we went through that phase in, I guess, training, if you want to call it that, if it's pretty much looking at trying to implement activating the relevance of the content of the student as recognizing themselves as an agent of change. Is that kind of what the theory is kind of allowing for, or trying to get you to even try to invoke in your students? Is that kind of...
For sure. Definitely, I think that's very explicit with Badiou, and perhaps more implicit with the terror management theory, where it's sort of like, how can we make the worlds that we need and want to make, and be part of that change.
Okay. So I'm going to not shift gears here a little bit, but I remember you just recently published something on the good old standardized testing.
Probably. I don't remember. I take a lot of pot shots at standardized testing.
So I guess I've kind of been, I don't know if I've maybe been successfully indoctrinated, but I guess when it comes to, I guess, the value of the diploma exam, I had a lot of conversation with, I had Tim Coates on, who like helped create the diploma exam for a lot of years. Yeah. Great guy.
Super guy.
But it just, every time I listen to him talk, I'm more convinced that they're like valuable. But every time I like talk to anyone else, I'm like, this is trash. So I just don't know how to like navigate that. So I guess and maybe if you're, I don't know how often you taught like social 30 in Alberta, or how it's, but I guess one of the main things I took away from Tim was that the goal is really to try and provide an equitable level of education on a certain standard across wherever a state or province tries to do the testing. And that I get. And that is, that I think is noble in a sense, like you're trying to implement that.
Absolutely.
But I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, for me, a lot is going to depend on the context. So, for example, my hatred of the SAT knows no bounds. I really hate that. And there's lots of like longitudinal work where the SATs reflect the square footage of your home and nothing else.
Yes.
And that sort of thing. So, and especially it's very high stakes, and it's very coded in all sorts of ways. So I have zero love. So I'm going to make a sweeping generalization about SATs that I dislike them with a fire of 1,000 suns. Now,
so I guess, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, but I have different feelings about the Alberta Social Studies. I taught 30-1, so I'm mostly familiar with that exam and taught that for several years, because I really do think, particularly the written portion, is probably like the best that a standardized test can be. Like I'm very impressed. Like Dwayne Gerard, who's run that for years, the wonderful Kim
Mhm.
Edmondson, who
Yeah.
has worked on that, and they have really crafted an exam that involves critical thinking. You can't just have like a potboiler essay that you just sort of pump out. Really thoughtful, really critical, really interesting in that regard. So, like for me, I'm like, if you're gonna have a standardized test in an area like social studies, let it be something like that. Where my view is not like 100% behind it is like, to what extent do we want the course to be weighted towards that material? And this is where there's a whole bunch of unintended consequences. Because there's so many cool things in the Alberta program of studies that cannot be tested. Like I'm thinking in the secondary social studies skills and processes outcomes, where you've got things like consensus building and these really awesome skills, but you can't test those on that test. So when the test is worth like 50% of your mark, that's very high stakes. And I feel
Yeah.
that a lot of teachers, because they're trying to serve their students as best as they can, because a good mark, can make or break university entrance, scholarships, all of these sorts of things. So of course we want to serve these young folk in good ways. But
Mhm.
are there some things that maybe get lost in translation, because
Yeah.
teachers are trying so hard with such good hearts to serve their students and have them do as well as they can on that test? Whereas if it was worth
Yeah.
30%, or
Which
if
it
it
is
was,
now. Yeah.
there you go. They see that helps a
Yeah.
lot. Or like, I would be really interested in it being an option. Students who would benefit from that, who want to really showcase their skills, raise their mark, this kind of thing, to make it sort of like let the beauty of that shine through.
Mhm.
Um, but at the same time, like just being careful, because I always think of that kid who's like cat died the day before. Like for me, I've always
Yeah.
been very attached to my little fur buddies, and that's not something you're going to get an exemption from, right? You would maybe if it
No,
was
no.
like a
Yeah.
parent or something like that. And I mean, if you're not in that zone on that one day, like, oof, I mean, it's a heartbreak. But I mean, there's no way that
Yes.
the test designers can do really anything about that. And as
No,
I said,
no.
I think in Alberta, they've done a fabulous job of that social studies exam. But
Yeah,
still,
and
because it's
because
high
always
stakes,
the
oof.
I know, because always the counter argument is like it should be project based learning. It shouldn't have such a heavy summative assessment, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess like it's almost kind of reassuring what you're saying, because one of the main things I took away from talking to Tim was that there's levels of doing standardized testing well. Like he's
Yes.
gone to places where like it's basically just memory recall questions, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just like there's no sources used at all. There's no kind of analysis actually really considered. There's no, I
Totally.
guess, um, there's no consideration of, oh God, I'm forgetting this one. Is it Bloom's taxonomy? Is that
Oh, yeah,
the
okay, probably Bloom's
scale?
taxonomy.
Yeah,
Sure,
like
yeah.
the different level of difficulties
Yeah,
in questions.
absolutely.
Um, which and that kind of makes sense. But when I see like how detailed and rigorous like that for what it is worth, I guess that's kind of what we're talking about. So yeah, I guess that's reassuring. But I guess what about the SAT? Because I know nothing about it, and I'm sure you're a bit more familiar with it now. What is it about that test that kind of ascribes it to pretty much being based off of your square footage?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things. So the test questions themselves can be culturally laden without people recognizing that it's culturally laden. So now this is an older example, so hopefully they still aren't using it. But there used to be a question about, where you're sort of trying to make comparisons. So it would be like, um, a teacup to a saucer is like this to, and then you'd have your ABCD. But I mean, having a cup and saucer to drink tea is a very like bourgeois British
Yeah.
kind of thing. A lot of people don't use a cup and saucer and these sorts of things. So that was sort of like laced with ethnocentrism, classism, these kind of things. So those
Yeah.
kind of questions are troubling. And also because of like the test culture here, like there are people who can afford to take it again and again, who can afford tutors, who can do all of these sorts of things. Whereas, there'll be other kids who, are working part-time jobs, in addition to doing full-time school and doing these sorts of things. So David Berliner is my favorite writer on this topic, and he's done studies over like decades where he's crunched the data And yeah, it's pretty appalling how that ends up being. And then you compound things like the SATs, which you do kind of at the end of high school here, with the prevalence of AP tests. There are kids here in grade 10 getting first year university credit. I'm like, can we not let a 16-year-old kid be a 16-year-old kid? Like, oh my goodness. Like, I'm all for extra learning for people who love it.
Yes.
But there's this like drive that you're now somehow behind.
The requirement.
Right. And then here in Texas, they have these STAR tests. Don't ask me what it stands for. Pretty sure the T is Texas, though. They do STAR tests, standardized tests every single year here. I used to think 3, 6, 9, 12 was a lot in Alberta. And I was really excited when there was talk about that being, maybe the drop in the 3 or something like that.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh my goodness. Like they lose 3 weeks in April every year for STAR testing. Can you imagine like what we could do with those 3 weeks, right? Not to mention all the prep that you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm very lucky that my son, he's in a specialized program. He's autistic. And so he's in a particular program called RISE. And so he gets accommodations for his STAR test. So he actually has a one-on-one interaction with his teacher who is talking about these things verbally with him. So it turns into a relational thing, even though it's a standardized test. So, I went in there, with my nose all out of joint thinking like, I'm going to pull him out of testing. I had all of my opinions, right? Came in, wielding my PhD like a big jerk.
Of course.
But then I at least thought for a second to ask a question first. And this is where, I think this terror management theory and all these sorts of things is, really, therapy and self-reflective. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to be curious. I'm going to ask a question first. And so I asked his teacher, I said, you as a teacher, what do you get out of my son doing this test? Do you learn anything about him? Does this help you teach him in any way? And he's I think was a bit surprised by the question, but then thought for a second and answered me. And he was like, actually, I do. He's like, because I get to do it one-on-one with him, it actually does give me tools to teach him for the last bit of school, as well as to pass on to his next year's teacher. It actually does give me something. And I was like, okay, great. Okay. I'm behind it. So even me with all of my opinions down here, I still had to nuance my view because all generalizations are false.
It is truly, truly humbling.
Right?
Yeah. You feel like you know less and less as you go. But I guess that's kind of also my reflex to just continually ask everyone that I know who has a heartbeat about standardized testing. Because I guess, because I was kind of put in, I've been teaching for pretty much 2.5 years now.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and maybe like 2.25, 2.5, and not that really matters.
It totally matters.
It's been put into all I've taught is 20-1 and 30-1, and I've done some like 30-2, 20-2. Like all I've done is high school, grade 11 and 12, and so like one of the things I've found very valuable is like, okay, even though I'm 2.5 years in, etc., I'm in my 5th time teaching these courses. Right, that's actually been very good for me to kind of do the constant reflection. But I almost feel the more and I'll be completely honest, I don't feel like a genuine pressure at all for kids have to do well in the diploma. It's like we do our best to actually just prepare them for them.
Love it.
And I had my best averages last semester, and so but I guess one of the things I've thought of potentially moving to a province that doesn't have standardized testing in grade 12. I'm like, I've basically tailored my idea of what education is around the preparation of this test, whether wittingly or unwittingly. And I'm like, I almost feel like a state of panic's the wrong word, but I would say just a general unease of okay, how do I make sure I'm still kind of affirming discrepancies, legitimate discrepancies of how do you award a 90 or a 95 or a 60 or 65? Because I've had this intense rubric and this intense diploma training of this is how you differ. This is the answer.
Sure.
So going and teaching somewhere where there isn't an answer is almost terrifying, because I've kind of had that to kind of lean back. Even today, for example, I had a student they're like you're not marking this. I'm like, it's all in service. Trust me. like we're always trying to build toward like kind of building that method kit or that toolkit or strategy kit to try and help them eventually do well on those tests after. But yeah, that's kind of, I'm curious to see, I guess, how people teach differently in contexts that do not have them. Because even I grew up in Alberta, so I took the 30-2 and then the 30-1 diploma myself. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of been my whole life. Like it's kind of just been a norm, right? So I don't know, like
Totally.
that'll be different for me because I guess I asked him, I said, well, would you recommend every province do this testing, or should we have Canada do like an Alberta type exam? And now
Ooh.
but I
What do you
guess my
say?
question is like, he said like, why not? And I
Interesting.
guess I guess maybe like where Alberta has developed it in isolation, I guess to an extent, like within
Mm.
its own province, maybe it is better because of that. Whereas if you kind of
Mm.
bring it out to the national, then you can start getting almost like too commercialized, maybe is kind of what I'm thinking in
Possibly.
terms of the I guess my only frame of reference of a national exam would be the SAT, which I know nothing about.
Hmm.
So, but I guess we talked about the Alberta one. I was like, oh yeah, it's a great exam for what they do, what they measure. Like it's great.
Yep.
So I guess why isn't that kind of because I guess everyone and their dog advocates against standardized testing. So I guess you're kind of in these two worlds, I guess, of these educators having these microaggressions against each other about standardized testing in a way. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a very slippery slope, I guess, to navigate. But thank
For
you for
sure.
indulging my standardized testing lane there.
I
I
love
just got a
it.
couple more questions for you there. I don't mean to keep you
Sure.
too long.
Oh no, all good.
Um, it was two things. One, you had an article about how we teach COVID differently, or sorry, how we teach social differently post COVID. And I
Right.
guess my first thing about that is post COVID social studies is my normal. And
Sure.
a
Yeah.
lot of the new teachers I talk to, I'm like, oh, it's almost like a make teaching great again environment, I would say, in a lot of
Mm.
education circles. So I guess how is it different to you? And I guess how do you recommend navigating how it's changed?
Mm. Well, I think, and part of the argument of that piece is we're all in a state of mortality salience. So death is on our minds even more than it was before. I mean, death is always around us, but we have, coping mechanisms to shove it down. And I think what COVID robbed us of, well, among actual lives, is also like that protection against, like, it can't happen to me, it can't happen to people I love, this sort of thing. So if everyone's in this state where death is more on their mind, then they're more prone to worldview threat or these sorts of things. So I think we have to be a lot more, I mean, for lack of a better word, maybe delicate as we're ramping up to things. Like, I think simple facts about either something that might be worldview threatening or something about death, I think that we can't possibly deliver those in a, or pretend to have them in a neutral sort of sense. They're gonna hit harder because we're in this different emotional space.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think and this was beyond
See that.
social studies, but just in education in general, like a lot of us are not okay physically, like due to long COVID, due to mental health issues because of that period, whether that's from being sick or having loved ones pass, um, that period of isolation that, of course, eroded some of our communities and relationships, which is what gives us a sense of security in an
Like the
insecure world in a
stains
beautiful
of
way.
COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's a call to do, I think, what many of us have called for just in general pre-COVID in terms of good social studies, where there's a lot of care and there's a lot of understanding, and yes, the facts are important, of course, and we're going to talk about things, we're going to talk about statistics and that, but social studies, I think, has to be more personal than ever and more relational than ever, which I hope is going to push folks to think. I hate that word or phrase, outside the box because it's so overused. And I mean, anything, it's like being in the box, I guess, is probably the whatever. But like thinking of things like I'm thinking of Dwayne Donald and his work outdoors with walks along the North Saskatchewan River. Like, how might doing social studies in part in ways like that, how might that open up for different relations, and relations with each other in that classroom, relation with communities, and relation to the content in ways that is, still intellectually rigorous, still provoking, but maybe because of that different method and that we're attuning to the physical as well as the cognitive, that maybe there's an opportunity for us there to do social studies better than what has generally been done for us mainstream, right?
Yeah, because I almost feel like like my inner critic always saying like, you're teaching this too traditionally. And I don't know if maybe that's just the imposter syndrome, whatever, in terms of I still try to do my activities, etc. But the idea of trying to take a walk along a river, and I think it would just take so much time to convince people that there is rigor in that still. And like there's still a learning output you're trying to achieve there. I think that's where there's still resistance because people think if you're not absolutely hating your life in the desk, then you're not learning, which I think is the most ridiculous concept ever.
Totally.
Ever conceptualized, I guess. But I guess, I think it is starting to trend that way. Because I even noticed there's a lot of like private schools now that are emphasizing like outdoor education. I think like that seems to kind of be, that's the lane where the market is going. So I can kind of see that being the lane where people are going to start wanting to make the kind of basic K-12 system more versatile or add more utility to it, I guess. I guess one of my last things is, why would you recommend someone be a social studies teacher?
Ooh. This might be my favorite
so
question.
Simple, but
right? Exactly. I mean, I think the most gorgeous thing about being a social studies teacher is that you are kind of in this in-between position, right? You're helping young folk navigate the world, like social studies, the study of the social. It's everything around us. Yeah. Like there's I think it's just this really beautiful thing where you're helping them bridge to each other, to their communities, to their country, to the globe, to this sort of thing. And you can be this wonderful guide. Like you can be this compass. Like they're deciding where to go. They're maybe having these educational events, but you are this lovely compass that's there to help them and support them and to help them make sense of things that sometimes we, even as adults, struggle to make sense of. And you can muddle through that together. And I think that's like a sticky space sometimes, but also that's where all the good stuff is. That's your compost, right? Like sometimes it can be stinky,
100%,
but the beautiful things can grow from it. So I really love social studies. And I mean, I don't want to disparage any other disciplines. I'm the daughter of a chemistry and physics teacher, and my mom was an art and English language artist. So yeah, I mean, I'm a nerd. I love school, but social studies is special. I think it's really special.
Hello, everyone. Again, just wanted to take the time to say thank you for listening in today. Just wanted to reiterate here that all conversations and interactions exchanged are intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. In no way do I intend for the content discussed to be in violation of the ATA Code of Conduct or to deliberately target any individual student, teacher, or to belittle or demean the profession in any way. If you have something you would like me to discuss or have a story of your own to share on the pod, please reach out at mrclarkafterdark@gmail.com, or you can also send me a direct message on Instagram at mrclarkafterdark. I really hope you guys enjoyed, potentially found something of use, and of course, again, as always, please do not forget to subscribe. Thank you and have a great day.